Hello and welcome to the American Founding with Jay Cost. My name is Scott Cross. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Faith and Freedom, and this evening, Dr. Cost will be lecturing on English liberty in colonial America. Just a reminder to keep your microphones muted during the presentation. However, there will be a brief Q&A session after the talk where you can ask Dr. Cost any questions you might have regarding tonight's topic. Now, without further delay, Dr. Cost.
Thank you very much, Scott. Thank you to everybody from Grove City who's joining us tonight on our Zoom chat. And for those of you who are joining us live from X or Twitter as it used to be known, and those of you who are maybe listening at a later date, my name is Jay Cost. I'm a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm a visiting scholar at Grove City College Institute for Faith and Freedom. And this podcast, The American Founding, is sponsored by Grove City College and the Institute for Faith and Freedom, which is worth a moment of consideration here before we begin. Grove City really is one of the best colleges and universities in Pennsylvania and the United States. I know this from personal experience. I've taught at Grove City. I teach high school at a small Christian school near here, and I often encourage the best and brightest students I have to go to Grove City. I think it's a great school. It fosters intellectual, moral, spiritual development consistent with a Christian worldview. And the college advocates individual freedom and personal responsibility. And as I've mentioned before, but it bears repeating, it is one of the few truly independent colleges in the country. It accepts no federal funding whatsoever, including federal student aid, which allows the college to operate free of government interference or political influence. And yet, nevertheless, it is still an affordable option for students, even without that federal aid. So you can learn more at faithandfreedom.com. So with that, I want to talk tonight, continue sort of what we talked about last week. Last week, I introduced the concept of liberty as it was understood to the Americans in two ways. One is the right to rule yourself, to be free of external constraints. And then the other one, which I talked a lot about, was the idea of self-government, that you are free because you are part of the lawmaking process. So you are governing yourself in a sense. And the point that I emphasized last week was this idea that the Americans, the colonial Americans, had developed a culture of this self-government, a culture that was very different than that which existed on the European continent, a culture that was free of the political and moral and economic rigidity of the Middle Ages. Tonight, though, we're going to talk about sort of the other side, right? I had mentioned there were two visions of liberty or two conceptions of liberty. There's this idea of self-governance, but then there's also the idea of being autonomous or free of external constraints. And that's what I want to talk about here. And what I want to talk about in particular is thinking about the English political tradition that developed. This is a tradition of power sharing that developed over hundreds of years that placed constraints upon the sovereign, or in other words, the king. And this gets formalized in what the English euphemistically call their constitution, although the English constitution is very different than the American constitution. Our constitution is written down. And the reason this is so important to talk about is that this is a lot of the major developments in the progression of what we would call English liberty is happening simultaneous to the settlement of the North American continent. That as the English are developing and working through these ideas and these struggles that lead to the development of political liberty, the Americans are settling North America and they are absorbing these ideas. And one of the things that we see in the American Revolution is a kind of universalization of these rights that during their time as colonists, the conviction was these are our rights as Englishmen. But as the English begin to violate these rights of the Americans, it becomes translated, and you see this particularly in Jefferson's declaration that these are our rights as human beings. So the Americans take this English tradition of liberty and they turn it into the standard by which all government should be judged. And so this tradition is important for us to understand, not only because it ends up informing the American system of government, but because America ends up really being the beacon of liberty throughout the world. This English tradition, by extension, becomes the same way as well. So, what I want to do here is I want to take a relatively brief overview of medieval England. And then what I want to do is focus in on England in the 1600s, because that is where we're going to see a lot of the action in terms of the development of political liberty. All right. And one of the things I want to point out is last week we talked about this idea of the great chain of being, this notion that God, in his divine wisdom, his inscrutable providence, has created the world in a kind of harmonious hierarchy. Um, and so authority, at least on paper, was vested in the king, just as authority was invested in the church, the spiritual authority. However, the medieval world in Europe does not really have anything approaching what we would call a modern state. It doesn't, so the king has the divine authority from God. But it's one thing to claim the authority and one thing to will things. It's another thing to effectuate the will, to make it real. And so what this means is there's a kind of tension within the medieval system, where the king claimed to be God's anointed, but he depended very, very heavily on the cooperation both of the church and of the nobility within his realm. And this manifests itself in different ways in different European countries. The Germans, for instance, start the Middle Ages with a relatively strong monarch who goes up against the church and ends up having basically all of his power destroyed by the time we get to the modern era. In England, it's a really interesting development, particularly because the English had, for much of their history, had what I think it would be fair to call foreign kings. So what do I mean by this? Well, in 1066, you have the Norman invasion, right? William the Conqueror defeats Harold Godwinson, and claims for himself the crown of England. But William the Conqueror is a Norman. This is a province in France. Normandy is a province in France that had been settled by the Scandinavians. So you have this kind of sort of Scandinavian French kind of king, and he brings his aristocratic class into England. And for about a generation or two, the new Norman aristocracy is speaking French, while the Anglo-Saxon majority is speaking Old English or whatever it was at that. I think it might have been Middle English at that point. The point is that you have this foreign king. And then something like this happens as well toward the end of the Norman line. In 1154, Henry II becomes king. Now, he's a direct descendant of William the Conqueror, but he's also the Count of Anjou, and he's the Duke of Aquitaine. This is where, if you are interested or familiar with medieval English history, this is where the Angevin Empire comes from. Angevin is the Latinized version of the word Anjou, right? And his son is Richard the Lionheart, who's famous for being kind of character in Robin Hood. He's really famous for going on crusades. But what is noteworthy for our purposes here is that he really doesn't spend much time in England, right? And this sort of view here by the reign of Richard the Lionheart, you have this empire that spans England, but also includes these large, very wealthy provinces in France. Now, over time, these Norman conquerors integrate with the existing Anglo-Saxon population, but it creates an interesting dynamic in which English kings who failed to keep different factions within society happy were subject to threat. Now, in rare occasions, like for instance in the reign of Richard II, it could be a peasants' revolt. More likely, it's a threat from other noblemen. Sometimes it's going to be a threat from the church. Sometimes these threats result in, frankly, murder, like in the case of Richard II, who was murdered, and also Henry VI, who was also murdered. But sometimes you see something different. Sometimes what you see are institutional reforms. And these institutional reforms have the effect of beginning to share power within the realm. So let's think about these. I mean, and I should add, institutional reforms are also a product of stronger kings like Henry I and Henry II. They build out the English state. Weak kings are more likely to get murdered or pressured into institutional reforms. This is where the Magna Carta comes from in 1215. This is historically the foundational document of English liberty. It is a written statement of the limits upon kingly authority that was agreed to by John, who was the youngest son of Henry II and the younger brother of Richard the Lionheart. John had angered the nobility so badly that he had no choice but to sign it in 1215. And by the way, as a side note, you can always tell which English kings are good and which English kings are bad based upon whether or not there's been another one. There has never been a John II, and there probably never will be. Now, John almost immediately reneges on the Magna Carta with the blessing of the Pope, but he dies shortly thereafter, so creates a precedent. Later kings hemmed and hawed over Magna Carta, but over time it becomes part of this institutional England English constitution. Another important medieval development was the invention and institutionalization of Parliament. Now, Parliament had existed kind of in the Anglo-Saxon era as a council of noblemen who advised the kings, but it's really first implemented by a guy named Simon de Montfort in his attempts to overthrow Henry III, who's one of these weak kings. Henry III, though, has as his son a very strong king named Edward. Edward comes and overthrows de Montfort's coup, but Edward keeps Parliament, becomes known as Model Parliament. And Parliament turns out to be very useful for the king. Parliament becomes a way to legitimize tax increases. So if the king wants to get more money beyond his current revenue sources, and the king had revenue sources from his land and the rents on his land, and he also had sort of ancient revenue sources, something, for instance, known as ship money, so he could, basically claim customs duties on stuff that's being imported. But if he needs more than that, more than what he usually gets, he's got to go to Parliament. This also is a venue for the king to receive public sanction to major changes that he seeks to make in the law. So a great example of that is Henry VIII. When Henry VIII becomes king in the 15 teens, I think. I don't remember. I think 1507. 1507. Henry becomes king. And when his wife, Catherine of Aragon, is unable to produce a male heir, or at least one who lives into past infancy, they do have a male who dies right away. She's unable to produce an heir. Henry wants to get a divorce, specifically wants to get an annulment. The Pope won't grant it to him. And so what does Henry do? Well, he goes to Parliament to have himself declared head of the English church, right? So what Henry was really kind of doing there was a power grab over the church, but to legitimize it and to get public buy-in, where does he go? He goes to Parliament. So Henry VIII is a Tudor monarch. The Tudor family takes over in 1485. So you have Henry VII, Henry VIII, and then Edward VI, or excuse me, Mary, then Edward VI, and then Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I is queen for about 45 years, I think 1558 to 1603. Now, by this point in the Tudor era, the monarch is thoroughly English. So this period of foreign kings is really well and truly over. And this is also a period in which the monarch is in charge. This is sort of the high point of English royal power is Henry VIII and particularly Elizabeth Tudor. Still, nevertheless, he, in the case of Henry, or she, in the case of Elizabeth, have to govern with Parliament. The sovereign is sort of the dominant force in government, but Parliament has to be consulted on things. And Elizabeth dies in 1603. And this is where our story gets a lot more interesting and a lot more relevant to what would be the United States of America. Elizabeth dies with no direct descendants. And so the English again have to bring in a foreign king. This time they do it from Scotland. His name is James Stuart. He's the cousin of Elizabeth. If you've ever heard of Mary Queen of Scots, he was Mary Queen of Scots' son. He had been crowned at infancy James VI of Scotland, and in 1603 he becomes James I of England, which is what he's commonly known as. Nowadays, we don't really think of England and Scotland as being separate countries, but they were separate countries. And in fact, Scotland was often an ally of France in its sort of disputes with England. So James is a foreign king. And importantly, the Scottish do not have a system similar as the English, where the sovereign has to rule in respect to Parliament. That Parliament has to be consulted, or at the very least, Parliament has to be, managed, for lack of a better term. And as a consequence, James and especially his son Charles run into trouble with Parliament. And over the course of the Stuart era, right, this family, this royal family, the Stuart family, over the course of the Stuart era, Parliament wins. Right. So, and another thing to bear in mind about this period of the 1600s is that power is also shifting within Parliament. It's moving out of the House of Lords, where the landed nobility are situated, and moving into the House of Commons. A lot of that has to do with the merchant and middle class, which is more represented there. Okay. Now, the Stuarts need, in the Stuart era, toward the end of the reign of James I, the Stuarts are trying to fight wars against the Spanish and the French. They're not going well. Charles I, who's crowned king in 1625, goes to Parliament and asks for money. He needs a tax increase to finance this war. But Parliament, what Parliament wants is a say in foreign policy. Parliament doesn't like these wars. And Parliament also doesn't like the king's advisors. They don't like him, right? And this is something, these question of foreign policy, and the question of who is advising the king. In this case, it was the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers. These were typically a matter of royal prerogative. Right? These are not things that Parliament historically got itself into. So Charles is very offended by this, and Charles is has if you've ever seen, there's famous portraits of Charles I by Van Dyck. Charles was not a very tall man, but he really does have the look of a king. He really does, and he bears himself with kind of royal bearing. He's not a particularly broad-minded thinker, and he's really obsessed with etiquette and formality and things like that. And as far as he's concerned, this is an insult to his royal authority. Nevertheless, Charles needs the money, so he agrees, and he agrees to what becomes known as the Petition of Right. And there's a couple points in the Petition of Right. I want to list them because they're going to sound familiar, and there's a reason why. One is no paying a tax without the consent of Parliament. In other words, as the Americans might say, no taxation without representation. Um, Anybody who is arrested has the right to receive a writ of habeas corpus. In other words, they have a right to know what they're being charged with, which is also in our United States Constitution. Uh, Charles agreed to no billeting of soldiers without consent. That shows itself up in our Third Amendment, which is the right to not have soldiers quartered in your domicile except in times of war, and also with the consent of Congress. So you begin to see here that a lot of the efforts of the English in the 1600s to limit the power of the king are going to show up in our own system of government, because this is a very instructive period for the Americans. So Charles continues to feel that Parliament was interfering in his prerogative, so he dismissed it in 1629, and that's a power that the English king had. If the king doesn't think the Parliament is doing a good job, or he just doesn't want to deal with it, he can just send them home. And he did that in 1629. It's a pretty common thing that was done, but Charles dismisses Parliament and he rules without Parliament for 11 years. It's known as Charles's personal reign. Now, he actually does a pretty good job during this period. The challenge the king has in the personal reign is, well, how am I going to run the government if I don't have access to new taxes or tax revenue? Because if I'm not calling Parliament, I have to live within my means. Well, he does that. He cuts spending. One of the ways kings could often sort of run into trouble. His father James had this trouble where you spend on big building projects, or you have a very elaborate court where you throw a big party every night. Charles doesn't do that. He cuts spending. He also stretches his taxing powers to what he thought was the limit, but a lot of people in England thought was well past the limit. and things are going well, and he until he tries to impose the Episcopal system that was in the Church of England on Scotland, which had a Presbyterian system. When he does that, Scotland rebels. So there's like a civil war basically starts in like 1638 or something. And the war goes badly, and Charles has to call a new parliament. And so in 1641, Parliament comes back and it is mad. This is really, in a lot of respects, this Parliament, this is like the first real parliamentary elections. Pretty much everybody's mad at the king. The only question is, how mad are you? Are you mad enough that like are you like annoyed and you're gonna vote for somebody who will still give the king his money, but who will like, expecting the king will listen to your petition? Or do you want to actually vote for somebody who's gonna put a stop to what the king's doing? And the people who wanted to put a stop to the king's efforts, they win the parliamentary majority. So this is really the first time in England that you see a parliament that is pointed against the king. It's very unprecedented. And this parliament, which it becomes known as the Long Parliament, doesn't mess around. They sought to limit the king's power over not just taxation, but also religion, because this is a time of Puritan revivalism in England. Charles was not a Puritan. He was a Loudian, named after the Archbishop William Laud, who was a persecutor of the Puritans. And accordingly, Parliament actually sought to have William Laud removed. Also, with this war going on, Parliament was willing to fund the war, but they wanted to have an independent military governor. In other words, they don't want to give Charles the power of the army because they were afraid Charles was going to use it on them. And they weren't wrong to think that, because in January 1642, Charles's men enter Parliament to arrest the leader of the Parliament faction, John Pym. Now, Pym and his allies receive advance word. They hightail it out of there. This leads to the English Civil War. And I just want to stop for a minute, and I want to point out to you that one of the important aspects of our Constitution is the extent to which the executive branch is not allowed to interfere in the affairs of the legislative branch. There are very, very important prerogatives that members of Congress have against executive interference. So they have, I'll talk more about this later, but they have, for instance, the right to speech on the floor of the House. They also are free from arrest while they're going about their business. And these are the sorts of protections that the framers wrote into the Constitution out of the experience of the English Civil War. And actually, every year you can get a sense of this, because whenever the president gives the State of the Union address, he has to be invited by the Speaker of the House. And it's important that it's actually the Sergeant at Arms who announces the president. President, I mean, nobody is allowed to knock on the door of the House of Representatives and be invited in, right? Even United States senators, even the President of the United States cannot just go into the House of Representatives, nor can his agents, right? The House is protected from the executive branch under the Constitution. This is a big reason why. So we get the English Civil War. Ultimately, Charles loses, and he's beheaded on January 31st, 1649. After which is a decade of becomes a commonwealth. Basically, what happens is a faction within Parliament decides to execute the king. Then they rule without a king. That military commander named Oliver Cromwell basically becomes king in all but name. When he dies in 1660, the English have regrets, and the feeling is that we should bring the monarchy back. So Charles II, who is the eldest son of Charles I, who had been in exile in France, is brought back, and he rules for 25 years. He's actually a very underrated monarch. He's extremely tactful in his dealings with Congress and all of these sort of underlying questions about, well, we're a Protestant country. How do we treat the Catholics? He's very delicate in how he handles the rebellion. I will say, as a fun digression, one of the things that he does insist on, and there were sort of elaborate negotiations on the return of the king. One thing that Charles does insist on is that that those who signed his father's death warrant be tried for treason. Charles's real problem is that he has no legitimate children. He has something on the order of 24 illegitimate children with a series of mistresses, but no legitimate children. So by the 1670s, it's clear that he and his wife, Catherine of Braganza, are not going to have a son, not going to have an heir. And so that means that Charles's younger brother, James, is the next in line. The problem is James is a Catholic. And this is a time when Catholicism in England was not allowed. And there's this period known as the Exclusion Crisis in the 1670s, where basically a faction of Protestants known as the Whigs want to get rid of James II, keep him from the throne, but James ultimately prevails. Okay, so James becomes king in 1685. And unlike his older brother, he is not tactful. He begins the project of essentially legalizing Catholicism and allowing Catholic military officers and Catholics in the government, and basically alienating pretty much everybody who had supported him in the exclusion crisis a decade earlier. And then finally, in 1688, his wife has a son. Now, this is important because he had a wife. This is his second wife. Mary of Modena is his second wife. His first wife was a Protestant, and she bore him two children that lived to adulthood. Mary, who is married to William, who's the stadtholder of the Netherlands, and Anne, who's married to, I think, a Danish heir to the throne or something like that. Anyway, the point is that the feeling was is that when James became king, okay, we don't want a Catholic, but he's in his late 50s. It's 1685. How long is the guy gonna live? We have Mary waiting in the wings to become queen. She's a Protestant, so we'll be fine. But then James, Mary of Modena bears him a son. Um, and it's at this point that the English Whigs invite William of Orange and Mary to come and rule. Now, I want to make another sort of stop here and point out that the faction that wanted to get rid of James, whom they considered to be a tyrant, were nicknamed the Whigs, and that becomes an English political party. And that is the same name that the opponents of Andrew Jackson used to christen their political party in the 1830s, because they thought that Andrew Jackson was behaving like a tyrant. So again, this stuff is this history is sort of distant to us, but in the process of constitution making, it was pretty close to the Americans. I mean, if you think about it, like 1689 is less than a century from 1776. I mean, the distance from the Glorious Revolution to the American Revolution is about the distance of the Great Depression to today, or maybe even closer to World War II to today. So this stuff is sort of still kind of in the public imagination. And William and Mary, upon being invited into England in what is known as the Glorious Revolution, they agree to what becomes known as the English Bill of Rights, and this limits the king further. Parliament is given guaranteed right to meet. I think it's called the Triennial Act. It meets every 3 years. It's given greater control over taxation. Freedom of speech is guaranteed in Parliament. Again, that's right, something that influences our own Constitution. You also get a guaranteed right to petition the government for redress of grievances, which is in our Constitution. You get prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. So our Eighth Amendment is actually derived like directly from the English Bill of Rights. And so actually is the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment guaranteeing the right to keep and bear arms. The English Bill of Rights guarantees the rights of all English Protestants to keep and bear arms, right? And over the course of the 1700s, Parliament's power over the purse becomes de facto governing power, because what's going to happen here is that England is going to go into a series of wars, really like from like 1690 all the way up till 1815. The English are almost always fighting the French. It's often known as the Second Hundred Years' War. And these wars are expensive, and the king needs Parliament for the money. And so Parliament uses its power over the purse to basically acquire de facto governing power. Another thing that Parliament does is in 1701, so this is after Mary is already dead. I think William's still alive. I think he lives until like 1702. But it's clear by that point that neither Mary nor Anne are going to have children of their own to live into adulthood. So the question is, well, okay, well, who comes next? And the Act of Settlement of 1701 declared that a Catholic could not inherit the throne of England. And so that means that after Anne, the next in line is Sophia, who's the Electress of Hanover, which is a tiny little German province that nevertheless had a descendant of, I think, James the First or something random like that. They actually to name Sophia the next in line, they have to skip over James Francis Edward, who was the son of James II, but they also skip over about 40 other Stuarts who are themselves Catholic. Um, so when we think about this, um, in sum, over the course of the Stuart era, because the Stuart era sort of begins in 1603 with the ascension of James I, and then it ends in 1714 with the death of Queen Anne. Sophia actually dies before Anne does, so her son George becomes George I, and this is the Hanoverian dynasty. So when we think about this period, we see that Parliament removed from government Charles I, and removed from government James II, and also, if you think about it, like prevented um, James II's son, James Francis Edward, from becoming king. All right, so Parliament is removing a whole number of people from becoming king. Meanwhile, it invites Charles II to become king. It invites William and Mary to become king. And then in 1714, it invites George to become king. Right? So we go from this sort of previous in the Tudor dynasty, where the king was really the dominant faction, the dominant player in government, to really now Parliament being the dominant player. Like if Parliament can remove the king, but the king has to call Parliament, who's really in charge? And so, as a consequence, at the start of the 1700s, it was pretty firmly established that the king not just governs with the consent of Parliament, but the governance is actually expressed through Parliament, right? That the governance is happens through Parliament, and that the king's ministers govern with the consent and the approval of Parliament, which, by the way, suits George I perfectly well. Ditto George II. George I wasn't even a native English speaker, neither was his son George II. George I spends about 20% of his time while he's on the English throne back in Germany. Right. So this is the period in which we see the emergence of parliamentary governments. Also, it's also King George's period in which we see the emergence of the Prime Minister Robert Walpole, who is a member of Parliament, is actually managing the government. So why does all this matter? Well, I've sort of left, hopefully you can appreciate there's sort of been a bit of a trail along the way of these things that kind of influence the American founding and pop up in the Constitution. But what I want to emphasize here is that the events that I've described, remember, like Jamestown is settled in 1607. The Georgia colony, which is the 13th of the colonies, is settled in, I think, like 1712 or something like this. So all of the events that I've been describing here are happening while America is being settled. And many of the colonies are actually a product of these events. For example, I think maybe the best example of this is the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was founded by Puritans who were fleeing what they considered, and I think what you could reasonably call to be the persecution under Archbishop William Laud. And when the Commonwealth was declared after the election of, or after the execution of Charles I, a lot of those Puritans went back home to England. And you see this in other places as well. Like for instance, in the reign of Charles II, you see the emergence of the Pennsylvania colony, allowing Quakers to leave because the Quakers weren't happy with the existing religious settlement of the Restoration. They didn't want to have to pay taxes to the Church of England because this was sort of a period when the Church of England, after having been laid low during the Commonwealth period of Cromwell, is sort of restored. And the Quakers didn't like it. So a lot of these, it's not simply that this is happening concurrently with America, it's that these events are influencing the existence of the colonies themselves. So what we have then is in the American colonies is the establishment of the political principle that power is and should be shared. That is the major idea that develops in the 1600s in England. It is the development of the notion that power is properly shared between the king and the representatives of the people elected through parliament. And it's in also to sort of kind of tie a bow around all of this. This is in the future, in the 17, I think in the 1740s, a Frenchman by the name of Montesquieu writes a really sprawling book called The Spirit of the Laws. That's a really dense read, but it was very popular in colonial America because one of the points that Montesquieu makes in it is that it is this power sharing in England, or what we today call the separation of power in the United States. We call it this separation of power, but this that had developed in England during the Stuart era, it is this that actually is the best way to safeguard liberty. Because when you have a different person writing the law than the person who's enforcing the law, than the person who is adjudicating disputes under the law, that is how liberty is protected. That is how you maintain what, for lack of a better term, I'm calling personal autonomy. But the Americans would probably call your natural right to life, liberty, and property. Right. So this, regardless, this idea of both your civil rights, so things like right to a jury trial, right to petition the king for redress of grievances, also your economic rights, of against unfair or arbitrary taxation, or against, the misuse of the court system, which is something that the Stuarts had done, like if you've ever heard of Star Chamber, that was a court that was popularized during the reign of Charles the First. It was a way to sort of circumvent the typical procedure, and it was a way for the king to go after people he considered seditious or too critical of his reign, right? This stuff comes to an end, and there is a due process that develops and is solidified and is acknowledged explicitly in the English system. Right. And what I think is interesting, and one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this, is that it sort of relates to a point that I made last week, is that the Americans universalize these values. That's what Jefferson does in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, he declares, but they're not really self-evident. I mean, it's great language, it's wonderful rhetoric, but the reality is that this was a system that evolved over time. This is not a system, this is not a worldview that somebody just sat down and as soon as they thought of it, they realized that it was immediately true, which is what self-evident means, right? This is a consequence of political calculations in some cases, like by, for instance, Edward the realizing the value of having parliament, and then in other cases like Charles the and James the miscalculations, things that they guessed wrong on, and as a consequence, they lost the political battles and the crown's power was permanently diminished. And it really sort of sets up what I think is the essential question, or maybe better put, the ontological or metaphysical question of the American Revolution, because there's a lot of different ways you can look at the American Revolution. But if you want to think of it as a sort of philosophical question, it is, who are the Americans? Who are they? Right? Are they English? Because if they're English, then they're entitled to all of these rights that had developed in the 1600s and had become settled matter by the 1700s. Are they something less than Englishmen, which is what the English said? They said, well, you're not really English. You have virtual representation. You're colonists, right? But the English say, no, no, we are Englishmen, right? And when push came to shove on the issue of things like taxation, and the English or the Americans were really forced to think things through, they said, yo, you know what? The only legitimate form of government for us as Englishmen is for the king to govern in conjunction with our colonial uh, legislatures, and which, Parliament was never going to happen. Parliament was never going to let that happen, right? As far as Parliament was concerned, the Americans had always been under the domain of the king and Parliament, that they had governed the external relations of the colonies, and after the French and Indian War, they were going to govern the internal relations as well. You're not actually English, or at least the English refuse to recognize that as the essential question. This is just a matter for them of raising money, right? Um, and ultimately, Great Britain didn't possess and couldn't build out the instruments of state authority to coerce the colonists. Right? The colonists were not going to go along with British rule. Sooner or later, Britain was not going to enable it and was not going to be able to rule. Right? So then, to sort of bring all of this together from last week and this week, we have an America that expects and demands to be free in two respects. The first one is this idea that Americans get to participate in the lawmaking process. This is what we might call Republican liberty. And the second one is this idea that the Americans are free from uh, unfair, illegal coercion, right? That what we would call liberalism in the classical sense. These are their expectations. Now, this lecture series is not really going to be a lecture series about the American Revolution. Instead, what I really want to do in this series is talk about the founding, but in particular with an emphasis on the creation of the American state, especially the Constitution, right? So the Americans, having declared their independence and having committed themselves to these two foundational ideas of republicanism and liberalism, what they need to do next is to build their own institutions to secure these goals. Right. And that is what we're going to begin talking about next week. All right. So, having established this idea that the Americans, just by their cultural marination, are well suited to Republican liberty, and the English political tradition leads them to a strong belief that government exists to protect their rights, particularly their right to property. Right. So, the question then becomes, how are the Americans going to realize these two ideals of republicanism and liberalism? And the first attempt at this is a complete disaster. And that is known as the Articles of Confederation. Sometimes I like to call it America's Mulligan, right? Everybody gets one free whack at the golf club before we start counting, and that's what that was. So before we get to talking about the Constitution and the origins of the Constitution, what we need to do is we need to see, okay, what was their first attempt? Why did it look the way that it did, and why did it fail? So we're going to begin looking at the Articles of Confederation next week, which I think you'll find to be a really interesting discussion because it is actually, for how brilliant the Constitution ends up being and how much I think the Constitution has been vindicated by history, the Articles of Confederation are really a government that is just plain doesn't work. It's just a broken system that starts malfunctioning almost immediately. And it almost cost the Americans the war in many respects. It should be an interesting conversation. We're going to start that next week. So thank you for your time and attention here. So if those of you who have been listening have questions, that would be great. Yeah, so fire away if you have questions. If you don't, that's okay too. I won't be offended.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
I'll turn
Yeah.
my video on. So I think I read it in Jefferson's autobiography, and it's just a short little thing. But I think in there he says something like, and as far as this idea with respect to the Declaration, right?
Hmm.
With respect to the idea that this is uh, um, self-evident, he pretty much states in his autobiography, as I recall, that hey, I didn't think up or dream up anything new at all here. This is basically what all of us were thinking. So all I did was kind of put it down in words, and that's how I took the meaning of these truths that are self-evident. So you did a great job of kind of laying out the history of where the founders would have been, with respect to the history and reading the philosophy of some of the guys you mentioned, Montesquieu
Yeah, sure.
and Locke. That this was the general thinking across these. I'll call them, somewhat of an elite. Um, this just would have been the general thinking across these guys. So, would you care to comment on that? And do you recall the quote from Jefferson's autobiography that I'm
Yeah,
talking about?
yeah, sure. Thank you for that comment, Ken. So Ken made the point that in many respects that, and he mentioned, he mentioned that Jefferson sort of his basic point was that these were sort of ideas that everybody was thinking about at the time, and that's the sense in which he meant that these were self-evident. Um, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's certainly in the mix at the time. I also think that there is something to bear in mind here. Well, before I get to that point, let me just say to the point about the question or the issue of things are in the cultural milieu. This is the opening of the Virginia Declaration of Rights that was written by George Mason. And the Virginia Declaration of Rights is adopted right around the same time as the Declaration of Independence. This is the opening that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. So I think that the similarity between Mason's declaration and Jefferson's declaration has been often noted. I mean, I think that Jefferson just really he wrote a lot better, which is probably why Jefferson has a much nicer monument on the Potomac Basin than Mason. Although if you're down in the Potomac Basin and you're looking to see the sights, don't you should do yourself a favor and check out Mason's um, memorial. But I think there's another sense in which this is going on as well, and which is Enlightenment political philosophy, where there is an increasingly a belief that reason alone can divine, uh, for lack of a better term, moral truths, that a science of morality or a science of politics is possible. Certainly, a science of politics is something that was commonly agreed to in, for instance, the Federalist Papers. Both Madison and Hamilton both used that phrase. And the Enlightenment is this intellectual movement during this period that really emphasizes the use of reason alone. It's influenced by the scientific revolution, certainly influenced by the by Newton, the Principia, and this conviction that through, I don't want to say a scientific analysis per se, but kind of through a rational analysis, we can develop truths about political right and wrong, proper political societies, and also like the nature of God himself. This is sort of kind of a high watermark for what we might call natural religion. Jefferson, or what we today often call deism, that Jefferson was a deist. He didn't believe in revealed religion, but he believed that God, as the author of nature, had left it clear in his design who he is. And I think the Declaration in Jefferson's introduction reflects that kind of Enlightenment confidence as well. So I think both points are perfectly valid, and I thank you for your comment. Well, let's see here. Anybody
Thank
else?
you.
Yeah, sure. Other questions? Anybody else have any other questions? That was a great question there. Ken, I appreciate it. Anybody in our group chat have a question or would like to ask a question? All right. Well, I'm not seeing anybody here, but that was a great question, Ken. I appreciate it. And I would, of course, like to thank the Institute for Faith and Freedom putting this putting this on for us. Um, and like I said, next week we're going to be talking about the Articles of Confederation, and pretty soon too. We're going to have the episodes are going to be available in podcast format. So you can look forward to those. It'll be on Apple Podcasts and Spotify or wherever you get your podcast stuff. So, and I guess before I let everybody go, I just want to give a thanks once again to Scott for putting all of this together. Thank you, Scott, for everything. And we will see you guys next week.